A billionaire businessman was walking through the city when he spotted a familiar face. A woman from his past, sitting on the sidewalk with two little girls. She was homeless, struggling, and completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. What he did next left everyone speechless. Nathaniel Calloway stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, his mind occupied with the usual weight of business negotiations and upcoming meetings. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, people weaving through crosswalks, voices blending into a dull hum of urban life. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but before he could check it, something caught his eye. A woman sat on the sidewalk, hunched over with two small children beside her. Her clothes were tattered, her hair a tangled mess, and exhaustion clung to her like a heavy shadow. The little girls, twins, no older than 4, were curled up close to their mother, their faces smudged with dirt. One of them was crying softly, rubbing her eyes with small trembling hands. "It's okay, sweetheart. Someone will help us soon," the woman murmured, stroking her daughter's hair with a tenderness that was both heartbreaking and desperate. Nate felt a strange tug in his chest. There was something familiar about the way she moved, the curve of her face, the sadness in her eyes. He took a slow step forward, his heart pounding. "Sophia?" he called hesitantly. The woman's head lifted at the sound of her name, her hollow eyes widening in recognition. For a moment she looked too stunned to speak. Then, as if reality had come crashing back, she quickly lowered her gaze, clutching her daughters protectively. Nate felt his breath hitch. It was her, Sophia Evans. The girl he had once admired from a distance. The girl who had lit up every room in high school without ever noticing him beyond casual pleasantries. The last time he had seen her, she had been full of life, confident and untouchable. Now she looked as if the world had broken her down piece by piece. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Sophia flinched as if his words physically hurt. She tightened her arms around the girls, pressing them closer. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're fine. Just go." But they weren't fine. Not even close. Nate could see it in the way her body trembled, in the way the little girl beside her whimpered, her tiny hands clutching her stomach in hunger. He had spent years making ruthless business decisions, sealing deals without hesitation, but at this moment, none of that mattered. He couldn't just walk away. "You're not fine," he said firmly. "Come with me. Let me help." Sophia shook her head. "I can't. I don't—" Her voice cracked, the weight of pride and shame holding her back. Nate crouched down, lowering himself to her level. "I'm not leaving you here," he said, his tone unwavering. "You and the girls, come with me. You don't have to trust me, but trust that I won't let you sleep on this street tonight." The girls looked up at him, their big, frightened eyes searching his face. The one who had been crying sniffled and pressed her lips together as if trying to be strong. The other one buried her face in her mother's arm, uncertain but curious. Sophia hesitated, her eyes darting toward the busy streets, then back to him. The years had changed them both, but something about Nate's expression made her want to believe that he meant what he said. She exhaled shakily and nodded. Nate pulled out his phone. "Be here in 5 minutes," he instructed his driver before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He extended a hand toward Sophia. She hesitated again, her fingers trembling before she finally reached out, placing her small, cold hand in his. The weight of that simple gesture settled deep in his chest. He gently picked up one of the twins while Sophia carried the other, and together they stepped toward his sleek black car. The ride was silent. Sophia stared out the window, her mind clearly lost in thoughts she didn't want to share. The twins, exhausted, rested their heads on their mother's shoulders, lulled by the warmth of the car. Nate stole glances at her, trying to reconcile the girl he had known with the woman sitting beside him now. He had 1,000 questions, but he knew that tonight wasn't the time to ask them. Right now, all that mattered was getting her somewhere safe, and making sure she never had to go back to that sidewalk again. Sophia sat stiffly in the luxurious black car, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughters. The city lights flickered across the tinted windows, casting fleeting reflections over her hollowed face. She kept her eyes fixed outside, as if watching the world pass by would keep her from fully grasping the reality of where she was and who she was with. Nathaniel Calloway. A man she hadn't spoken to in years. A man who, by all accounts, should have been a stranger. Yet here he was, stepping in without hesitation, as if rescuing her from the streets was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him, but she was tired, so tired. And her girls, Harper and Hazel, needed more than what her pride could afford them. Beside her, Nate glanced over, his sharp blue eyes studying her carefully. He wanted to ask questions. She could feel them pressing against the silence, but he held back. Instead, he simply said, "We're almost there." The car ride was quiet, almost suffocatingly so. The only sounds were the distant honking of traffic and the occasional sniffle from Hazel. Sophia kept her gaze low, focusing on the rhythmic breathing of her daughters rather than the man sitting beside her. Nate stole glances at her, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask yet. How had she ended up here? What had happened to the confident, lively girl he used to admire from afar? The last time he'd seen Sophia Evans, she had been the center of attention at every school event, effortlessly charming and always smiling. The kind of girl who had no idea someone like him even existed. But now? Now, she was a shadow of that girl. And he wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the fact that she had fallen this far, or the fact that no one else had been there to catch her. His grip on Harper tightened slightly. When the car finally pulled up to his mansion, Sophia stiffened. The estate loomed before them, bathed in soft golden light. The massive front doors, the polished stone driveway, the perfectly manicured hedges, it all screamed wealth and comfort, a world that felt galaxies away from where she had been just hours ago. She shifted uncomfortably. "You really don't have to do this, Nate," she whispered, voice barely audible. "No more arguing," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "You need food, rest, and safety. That's all that matters tonight." Sophia hesitated, looking down at her daughters, who were too exhausted to register their new surroundings. Then, with a quiet nod, she stepped forward. Mrs. Delaney, Nate's housekeeper, opened the door with a surprised expression but quickly masked it with professionalism. "Mr. Calloway," she greeted, her eyes flicking toward Sophia and the twins with barely concealed curiosity. "We have guests," Nate said simply. "Please prepare a guest room, one with enough space for the little ones." Mrs. Delaney nodded, wasting no time before heading off to make the arrangements. Sophia stood awkwardly in the grand entryway, her worn-out shoes looking painfully out of place against the gleaming marble floor. She didn't belong here. Nate noticed her hesitation and gently nudged her forward. "Come on, let's get you settled." He led them into the living room, where a fire crackled in the grand fireplace, filling the space with warmth. It smelled like cedarwood and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon. It reminded her of a home she hadn't had in a long time. Sophia lowered herself onto the plush couch, her body protesting at the unfamiliar comfort. Hazel and Harper curled up beside her, their small frames sinking into the cushions. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Nate sat across from her, his gaze steady. "Get some rest, Sophia. Tomorrow we talk." She nodded weakly, but in truth, she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that conversation. Because talking meant confronting the past. And she wasn't sure she had the strength to do that yet. Sophia woke up to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. For the first time in months, she wasn't shivering. The air smelled faintly of fresh linen and something sweet. Vanilla, maybe. She blinked against the soft morning light streaming through the sheer curtains, trying to process where she was. Then, she heard it. Laughter. Not the cruel, mocking kind she was used to on the streets, but the light, uninhibited giggles of her daughters. Sophia sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. For a moment, fear gripped her. Had she imagined everything? Had it all been some cruel dream? But then she saw them. Harper and Hazel were sitting on the plush carpet near the bed, playing with small stuffed bears. They were clean. Their tangled hair had been brushed into neat ponytails. Their once worn-out clothes had been replaced with soft, warm pajamas, and they were smiling. The knot in Sophia's throat tightened. "Mommy!" Harper grinned when she noticed her awake. "Look, Miss Delaney gave us new jammies, and we got teddy bears too. Sophia looked around, reality finally settling in. They were still in Nate's mansion. The room was spacious, but not overwhelmingly so. A queen-sized bed, a cozy reading nook by the window, and a fireplace that had long since burned out. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, feeling the softness of the carpet beneath her feet. It had been so long since she'd woken up somewhere safe, somewhere warm. A gentle knock at the door made her jolt. "It's just me," came a familiar voice. Nate. Sophia hesitated before calling out, "Come in." The door eased open, and Nathaniel Calloway stepped inside, looking effortlessly put together in a crisp white dress shirt and dark trousers. He carried a tray with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of toast and fruit. "You're up," he noted, glancing at the girls who were still immersed in their little game. I guess I am," Sophia murmured, still feeling like an intruder in this place. Nate set the tray on the small table beside the bed. "Mrs. Delaney made breakfast. I thought you might need something before coming downstairs." Sophia eyed the food warily. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate it. She just wasn't used to kindness without strings attached. "I don't want to impose," she whispered. Nate sighed and sank into the chair across from her. "Sophia, it's breakfast. Eat." She hesitated, but the rich aroma of coffee was too tempting. Tentatively, she reached for the mug, wrapping her hands around the warmth. The first sip sent a shiver down her spine. It had been so long since she'd had something hot to drink. Nate watched her, his sharp eyes studying every movement, but he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. When the plate was nearly empty, and the coffee was more than halfway gone, he finally spoke. "Come downstairs when you're ready. We need to talk." Sophia's stomach clenched. She knew this moment would come. She had spent all night trying to prepare for it. But no matter how many times she rehearsed the words in her head, she wasn't sure she could ever be ready to say them out loud. By the time she made her way downstairs, holding Harper's and Hazel's hands, the house was already alive with quiet movement. A light breakfast had been set on the grand dining table, but most of the plates had already been cleared. A few staff members moved about the house carrying linens and trays, their eyes polite but curious when they spotted her. She tried not to let it bother her. She tried not to feel like she didn't belong. Nate stood near the window in the dining room, sipping what she assumed was his second, or maybe third, cup of coffee. He turned when he heard them approach, his gaze first landing on the twins, then shifting to her. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." "Good." He gestured to the table. "Sit. The girls can go play in the garden after breakfast. There's a swing set out back." Harper's eyes lit up. "A swing set?" "Yep," Nate said with a small smile. "You can check it out after you eat." The girls eagerly climbed into the chairs, suddenly more interested in their food. Sophia, however, felt the tension building. Nate was waiting, and she couldn't put off this conversation forever. After the girls finished eating, Mrs. Delaney gently led them outside, leaving Sophia and Nate alone in the quiet dining room. The moment the door shut behind the housekeeper, Nate set his coffee down and leaned forward. "Tell me the truth, Sophia," he said, his voice calm but firm. "How did this happen?" Sophia stared at the table, tracing patterns on the tablecloth with her fingertips. She could lie. She could tell him it didn't matter, that she had already moved past it. But something about the way he looked at her, patient, unwavering, made her realize that for once, she didn't have to carry this alone. She took a deep breath. "It all started with Ryan Carter," she said softly. Nate's expression darkened instantly. "I should have known," he muttered, shaking his head. "You remember him?" she asked. "Of course I do." His voice was clipped. He was always the guy who could charm anyone but never took responsibility for anything. He had everything handed to him. Sophia let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, well, I was naive enough to believe he actually loved me." Nate stayed silent, letting her continue. "I fell for him after high school. He was charming, always knew the right things to say. I thought we had something real. But when I got pregnant, everything changed." She clenched her hands in her lap. "At first he told me he needed time to process it. I believed him. I gave him space. But then he started pulling away. He wouldn't answer my calls, stopped coming to see me. And when I finally confronted him, he didn't even try to hide it. She swallowed hard, her voice growing bitter. He told me he wasn't ready to be a father, that I was ruining his life, that it was my problem, not his. Nate inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. And he just left? Yes, she whispered. Silence filled the room. Sophia rubbed her arms as if trying to chase away the lingering cold of that memory. My parents weren't exactly supportive either. They didn't disown me, but they made it clear that they wouldn't help me raise 2 children alone. So, I did what I had to do. I worked. I saved every penny. But raising twins alone? She shook her head. It was harder than I ever imagined. Her voice dropped. I lost my job. The bills kept piling up. I held on for as long as I could, but eventually I lost the apartment too. And then, I had nowhere else to go. She looked up at Nate then, eyes filled with shame. That's how I ended up on the streets. Nate exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Why didn't you ask for help? His voice was softer now, less demanding, more gentle. Sophia swallowed. Because I was ashamed, she admitted, because I didn't think anyone would care. Nate leaned forward, his intense gaze locking onto hers. You were wrong. Sophia's breath caught. You were never alone, Sophia, he continued. Not then. Not now. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. For so long she had believed that she had to do everything on her own, that the world had given up on her. But here was Nate, looking at her like she was still worth something. You're not alone anymore, he said firmly. And for the first time in years, she believed it. Sophia stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest room, staring at the reflection before her. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who had sat on a cold sidewalk just days ago, clutching her daughters for warmth. She was still tired, still carrying the weight of years of hardship on her shoulders. But there was something else now. Something unfamiliar. Hope. The sound of tiny footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Mommy, Hazel's small voice called. Are we really going shopping today? Sophia turned to see her daughters standing in the doorway, their faces bright with excitement. Harper was bouncing on her toes, barely able to contain herself. Behavior, okay? Hazel nodded solemnly. Okay, Mommy. A knock on the door made Sophia glance up. Nathaniel stood there leaning casually against the frame, dressed in a tailored black suit, looking like he had stepped out of a magazine. Are you ladies ready? He asked, amusement glinting in his eyes. Harper ran to him without hesitation, reaching up her arms. Can we get princess dresses? Nate chuckled, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. I think that can be arranged. Sophia sighed, already knowing this trip was going to be harder than she had anticipated. The sleek black car pulled up to an upscale shopping district, where storefronts gleamed with designer labels. Sophia hesitated as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the weight of the unfamiliar surroundings pressing down on her. This is too much, she murmured, looking up at Nate. He shook his head. This is necessary. She wanted to argue, to insist that they could manage with second-hand clothes from a discount store, but then she saw the way Hazel clutched her too small jacket around her shoulders, the way Harper's shoes had worn down to almost nothing. Swallowing her pride, she followed Nate inside. The moment they entered the store, the twins were in awe. They ran from one display to another, their little hands touching soft fabrics and sparkling shoes. Sophia watched them, her heart aching. Let them enjoy it, Nate said beside her, as if reading her mind. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. Harper held up a glittering blue dress. Mommy, look, I can be a princess. Sophia ran a hand over the fabric, feeling its softness. You already are a princess, sweetheart. Hazel, the quieter of the two, tugged on a pair of shoes with little bows on them. Can I have these, Mommy? Sophia hesitated. She wasn't used to saying yes. But before she could answer, Nate stepped in. Of course you can. She shot him a look, but he simply smiled. Sophia sighed, finally giving in. All right, she said. Pick what you like. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she watched her daughters shop without restriction. And she felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Once the shopping bags were packed into the car, Nate took them to a nearby cafe. Harper and Hazel chattered excitedly over their hot chocolate, their eyes glowing with happiness. Sophia sat across from Nate, her fingers curled around a warm cup of coffee. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to." She sighed, staring down into her cup. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to." Sophia shook her head. "I do. I don't want to be someone who just takes." Nate studied her for a moment before leaning forward. "Then let me make you an offer." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "What kind of offer?" He pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket and placed it in front of her. Sophia hesitated before picking it up. Inside were printed details about a scholarship program, business courses, training programs, even an internship opportunity. She frowned, looking up at him. "What is this?" "A chance," he said simply. "A chance to build something for yourself, a future that isn't just about survival." Sophia stared at him, her mind racing. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "Yes, you can," he countered. "And you should." Her fingers tightened around the envelope. "Nate, I don't have time for this. I need a job, not a classroom." "I can help with that too," he said. "But think about what you really want, Sophia. Don't just settle for what you think you can get." She looked away, struggling with her emotions. "You don't have to decide now," he added. "Just consider it." Sophia swallowed hard, staring down at the papers in her hands. For so long, her only goal had been to survive. Maybe it was time to start thinking about something more. Sophia sat by the window of Nate's mansion, watching the twin girls play in the garden. The sun cast a golden hue over the grass as Harper and Hazel ran in circles, giggling as they chased a butterfly. The sight should have filled her with peace, but an unsettling weight had settled in her chest. She had spent the last few weeks adjusting to this new reality. Warm meals, a safe home, a future that didn't seem impossible. But the past still lingered, lurking in the back of her mind like an open wound that refused to heal. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Sophia?" Nate's deep voice was calm yet firm, as it always was when he had something important to say. She turned to face him, noticing the way his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. He was holding something in his hand, a manila folder. "What is it?" she asked, standing from her chair. Nate walked toward her slowly, setting the folder on the table between them. "I found him," he said simply. Sophia's breath hitched. She didn't have to ask who he was talking about. Ryan Carter, the man who had once promised her the world and then abandoned her the moment he learned she was pregnant. The man who had left her to struggle, who had never once looked back. Sophia swallowed hard, staring at the folder as if it might burn her fingers. "You—" She stopped, forcing herself to breathe. "You went looking for him?" Nate nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I needed to know if he ever tried to find you, if he regretted what he did." A humorless laugh escaped her lips. "And? Did he?" Nate clenched his jaw. Number he never even looked. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, unsurprised but still hurt. Even after all these years, a small, foolish part of her had held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, Ryan had changed. "He's working as a financial consultant," Nate continued. "Lives in a high-rise apartment downtown. No wife, no kids." She looked up at him. "And he never?" "No." Sophia exhaled, shaking her head. "Of course not." There was a long silence between them. Then Nate spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Sophia, you don't have to do anything with this information, but I thought you deserved to know." She stared at the folder for a long moment before reaching for it. Slowly, she opened it and scanned the neatly typed pages. Photos of Ryan, his address, his work schedule. It was overwhelming. "I need to see him," she said finally, surprising even herself. Nate's eyes darkened. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I don't expect anything from him. I need to face him. For myself." Nate was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. Then, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't like this, Sophia. I know. But if you're going, I'm going with you. She shook her head. No, Nate. This is something I have to do alone. His expression hardened. I'm not letting you walk into that alone. Sophia hesitated. She didn't want to involve Nate in something that was her burden to carry, but deep down, she was relieved that he refused to let her face it alone. After a pause, she nodded. Okay. The next day, Sophia stood outside the sleek glass building that housed Ryan's office. Her palms were sweaty, her heart racing. The last time she had seen him, she had been a scared, heartbroken teenager, begging him not to leave. Now she was a mother, a survivor, and she wasn't here to beg for anything. Nate stood beside her, his presence steadying. Are you ready? Sophia took a deep breath. Yes. They stepped inside. Ryan Carter was seated behind a massive desk, scrolling through his phone when his secretary led them in. He looked up with mild curiosity, then froze when he saw Sophia. For a brief second there was confusion in his eyes. Then, realization dawned. His expression shifted into something unreadable. Shock, discomfort, maybe even annoyance. Sophia? His voice was clipped, as if her presence was an inconvenience. Sophia squared her shoulders. Hello, Ryan. His gaze flickered to Nate, who stood protectively beside her, then back to her. What are you doing here? I wanted to see you, she said simply. Ryan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Why? Sophia inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay calm. I wanted to give you a chance to acknowledge the daughters you left behind. Ryan blinked, his expression briefly flickering with something unreadable before hardening. I don't have daughters. Sophia's stomach twisted, but she refused to look away. You do. Harper and Hazel. They're 4 years old. They're smart and kind and beautiful, and you walked away from them before they were even born. Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Look, Sophia, that was years ago. I was young. I didn't want to be a father, and I still don't. You can't just show up out of nowhere expecting me to suddenly care. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. I'm not expecting anything from you, she said, her voice steady. I don't need your money. I don't need your help. But I needed to see you. To hear it from you. To know for sure. Ryan scoffed. Well, now you do. Beside her, Nate's hands curled into tight fists. His voice was calm but laced with barely restrained anger. You don't feel even an ounce of responsibility? Ryan shrugged. I made my choice years ago. Sophia felt something inside her finally break, something that had been holding on for far too long. She nodded slowly. All right. Ryan frowned. That's it? Yes, she said. That's it. She turned on her heel and walked toward the door. For years, she had been haunted by the idea of Ryan, by what he had taken from her, by what he had refused to give. But now, standing in front of him, she realized something. She felt nothing. The man she had once loved, the man who had broken her, was nothing more than a stranger now, and she was free. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, she inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the past finally fall away. Nate watched her carefully. You okay? She let out a small, shaky laugh. I think I am. Nate studied her for a long moment, then reached out and gently took her hand. Let's go home. Sophia squeezed his hand back, feeling for the first time in years, truly at peace. Yes, she said, smiling softly. Let's go home. Sophia hadn't realized how much lighter she felt until she walked through the doors of Nate's mansion that evening. The conversation with Ryan, painful as it was, had freed her from the lingering doubts that had weighed on her for years. She no longer had to wonder if he'd change, if he'd regret leaving, if he'd ever come looking for their daughters. Now, she knew the truth, and she was ready to move forward. As she entered the grand foyer, the sound of laughter greeted her. Harper and Hazel were chasing each other through the living room, their tiny feet padding across the carpet as Mrs. Delaney watched with a warm smile. The sight filled Sophia with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She turned to Nate, who who had been quiet on the drive back. He had given her space, letting her process everything on her own terms, but now that they were home, his steady presence was still there, grounding her. "Thank you," she said softly. Nate glanced at her. "For what?" "For coming with me, for standing by me." He studied her for a moment, then simply nodded. "Always." Before she could respond, Harper noticed them. "Mommy." Both girls ran toward her, their small arms wrapping tightly around her legs. Hazel buried her face against her, her little voice muffled. "We missed you." Sophia bent down, gathering them both into her arms. "I missed you too, my loves." Nate stood watching them, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that made Sophia's heart ache in the best way. Mrs. Delaney cleared her throat. "Dinner is almost ready if you'd like to eat now." Sophia nodded, still holding on to the twins. "That sounds perfect." Harper grinned. "Uncle Nate helped us bake cookies today." Sophia raised an eyebrow, looking at Nate with amusement. "Did he now?" Hazel giggled. "He got flour everywhere." Nate shrugged, a rare sheepish smile tugging at his lips. "I may have underestimated how messy baking with 2 4-year-olds could be." Sophia laughed, a sound that felt natural and easy. "I'm sure they had a great time." As they moved to the dining room, she found herself watching Nate more closely. It wasn't just that he had taken them in, given them shelter, and supported her in ways she never expected. It was the way he was with the girls, the way he let Harper drag him around the house to show off her latest drawings, the way Hazel, usually so shy, had started holding his hand when they walked together, the way he cared. Dinner passed in a warm blur of conversation and laughter, and later that night, after she tucked the twins into bed, she found herself lingering by the large window in the sitting room, staring at the city lights beyond the estate grounds. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Nate approaching, his hands tucked into his pockets. "They went to bed easily?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "They were exhausted. You wore them out today." Nate chuckled. "I think they wore me out." Silence stretched between them, comfortable and unhurried. The air between them felt different now, charged with something unspoken. After a moment, Nate spoke. "How are you feeling? After today?" Sophia hesitated before answering. "Lighter," she admitted. "It hurt, but it also freed me." Nate nodded, his gaze steady. "Good." She shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the windowsill. "I didn't expect you to care so much." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She turned fully to face him, exhaling slowly. "The way you've taken care of us. The way you are with the girls. You didn't have to do any of this." Nate was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You and the girls aren't some burden to me, Sophia," he said, his voice low but firm. "From the moment I saw you on that sidewalk, I knew I couldn't just walk away." Her heart thudded. "Why?" Nate hesitated, then let out a quiet sigh. "Because it's you." The weight of those words settled over her, sinking into her skin, into her bones. Sophia swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. "I don't know if I'm ready, Nate." "I know. I'm still figuring things out. I don't want to rush into something just because you've been kind to me." His lips quirked into a small smile. "You think this is about kindness?" She bit her lip. "Isn't it?" Nate shook his head, stepping even closer. "Sophia, you and the girls have changed my life. I never realized how empty things felt until you were here, and I don't mean because I helped you. I mean you. The way you're determined to rebuild your life, the way you put your daughters first, the way you laugh when you forget to be afraid." He exhaled. "I admire you, and I care about you. This has never just been about helping." Sophia felt something crack open inside her. For so long she had been afraid to trust, afraid to lean on anyone, afraid to believe in something good. But Nate, he had been there through all of it, not demanding anything in return. Just there. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I care about you too, Nate. I do." Relief flickered across his face. "But I still need time." Nate nodded, his expression warm. Then I'll wait. Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. In that moment, she knew one thing for certain. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to believe in something more. Days passed, turning into weeks, and the once unfamiliar mansion slowly began to feel like home. Sophia was no longer just a guest, no longer just someone Nate had rescued. She had become part of the rhythm of the house, and so had Harper and Hazel. Nate, who once preferred the silence of his grand estate, now found himself adjusting to the sound of tiny feet running across the marble floors, the high-pitched giggles that echoed through the hallways, and the sight of Sophia humming softly as she tucked the girls into bed. He had thought his life was complete before, filled with wealth and success, but now he understood what had been missing. Them. One afternoon, as Sophia was finishing an assignment for an online business course Nate had enrolled her in, her phone buzzed on the table. She absent-mindedly reached for it, her focus still on the screen. But the moment her eyes landed on the message, she froze. It was an anonymous text accompanied by a photo. Nate was sitting in a restaurant, dressed in one of his sharp-tailored suits. Across from him was a woman, a striking brunette, elegantly dressed, leaning in as if sharing an intimate conversation. Beneath the photo was a single line. "Do you really know who you're trusting?" Sophia's stomach twisted painfully. A dozen emotions hit her at once. Fear, insecurity, doubt. She stared at the picture, bile rising in her throat. Had she been foolish? Had she let herself believe in something that was never real? The rational part of her told her that Nate wasn't like Ryan, that he wouldn't deceive her. But the scared, wounded part of her, the part that had been abandoned and betrayed, screamed otherwise. She needed to talk to him. That evening, when Nate arrived home, he found Sophia in the sitting room, her back straight, her hands tightly clasped together. The twins were upstairs with Mrs. Delaney, giving them the privacy they needed. The moment he saw her expression, his relaxed demeanor shifted. "Sophia? What's wrong?" She hesitated, then held up her phone, showing him the text. "I got this today." Nate's eyes darkened as he scanned the image, his jaw clenched. "Where did this come from?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I need to know. Is it true? Who is she?" His face softened as he looked back at her. "Sophia, that was a business meeting." Sophia swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe you, Nate. But I've trusted before and I was wrong." Nate took a slow step closer. "And I won't blame you for that, but I need you to trust me now. That woman is Vanessa Sinclair, an executive consultant. We're working on a new real estate investment together." He exhaled. Nothing more. Sophia studied his face, searching for any sign of dishonesty, any flicker of hesitation. But there was none. His expression was open, unwavering. "I don't know who sent this to you," Nate continued, his voice calm but firm. "But I can find out. And if someone is trying to manipulate you, I'll put an end to it." Sophia let out a shaky breath. Deep down, she had known. She had felt it. That Nate was different. But her past had trained her to expect betrayal, to guard herself against disappointment. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have doubted you." Nate's expression softened as he reached for her hands, threading his fingers through hers. "Sophia, you don't have to apologize. I know trusting again isn't easy for you. But I meant what I said. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something deeper. Gratitude, relief, and love. The realization hit her so suddenly that she nearly gasped. She loved him. It wasn't just gratitude for his kindness, or admiration for the way he had stepped in when she needed help. It was more than that. It was the way he made her feel safe without caging her. The way he saw her not as someone broken, but as someone rebuilding. The way he cared for her daughters as if they were his own. She lifted her gaze, her heart pounding. "I do trust you, Nate," she murmured. "I really do." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, something raw and unguarded. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was soft at first, hesitant, a whisper of a kiss. But then Nate's hands cupped her face, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss into something that stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was steady, certain, like a promise. When they finally pulled apart, Nate rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I've been wanting to do that for a long time," he admitted. Sophia let out a breathless laugh. "Me too." They stood there for a moment, wrapped in the quiet of the room, the weight of unspoken words lingering between them. Then, from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of Harper's voice echoed through the hall. "Mommy?" Sophia smiled, stepping back. "We should go check on them." Nate chuckled, nodding. "Yeah, we should." But as she turned toward the staircase, his fingers brushed against hers, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted between them. And for the first time in years, Sophia wasn't afraid of where it would lead. The days that followed their kiss were filled with an unspoken understanding. Something had shifted between them, something neither of them wanted to rush but both acknowledged was real. Nate no longer hesitated when reaching for her hand, and Sophia no longer pulled away when he held her gaze a little too long. The bond between them had deepened, no longer just an act of kindness or a shared past, but something stronger, something worth holding on to. Harper and Hazel, oblivious to the quiet transformation in their mother's heart, continued to thrive in Nate's home. They had grown attached to him, trusting him the way only children could, without doubt or hesitation. Sophia often found herself watching the three of them together, a lump forming in her throat at how effortlessly he had become a part of their lives. One evening, Nate asked Sophia to step outside with him after dinner. The night air was cool, the sky clear and full of stars. They walked through the garden in comfortable silence, the soft glow of lanterns lining the path. "I have a surprise for you and the girls," he said, stopping near the fountain. Sophia turned to him, curious. "A surprise?" Nate nodded, his hands slipping into his pockets. "We're going on a trip, just the four of us." Her brow furrowed. "A trip? Where?" He smirked. "It's a surprise." Sophia chuckled, shaking her head. "Nate, you can't just plan a trip without telling me where we're going." "Sure I can," he teased. "All you need to know is that you'll love it, and so will the girls." Sophia narrowed her eyes playfully, but inside warmth spread through her chest. He was including them, all of them. 2 days later, they were on a private plane heading to a beautiful beachside resort. The moment Harper and Hazel saw the ocean, they squealed in excitement, running toward the water as Sophia laughed, chasing after them. Nate stood back for a moment, watching them. Seeing Sophia happy, truly happy, was something he had longed for. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky, Nate led Sophia down the shoreline while Mrs. Delaney watched the twins. The waves lapped at their feet, the salty breeze wrapping around them. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Nate turned to her, his expression serious but filled with warmth. "Sophia," he began, his voice steady. "From the moment I saw you again, I knew my life was about to change. You and the girls, you've given me something I never even knew I was missing." Her heart pounded. "I don't want to spend another day without you," he continued, flipping open the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "I want to spend forever with you. Sophia Evans, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at the ring, then back at the man who had become her everything. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered. Then with more certainty, "Yes, Nate. I'll marry you." A brilliant smile spread across his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. From the balcony of their suite, Harper and Hazel clapped excitedly, even though they had no idea what had just happened. Their wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden of Nate's mansion. Sophia wore a simple but beautiful dress. Harper and Hazel dressed as flower girls, giggling as they scattered petals down the aisle. When Nate took Sophia's hands in his, looking at her with absolute devotion, she felt it in her soul. This was where she was meant to be. After the vows, after the laughter and the quiet, tearful moments, after the first dance under twinkling lights, Sophia stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Harper and Hazel dance in the grass. Nate came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" She leaned into him. How lucky I am. He kissed her temple. We're both lucky. A few months later, their family grew once more. Sophia sat in the doctor's office, gripping Nate's hand as the ultrasound technician moved the wand across her belly. Congratulations, the doctor said with a warm smile. You're pregnant. Sophia turned to Nate, eyes wide with emotion. We're having a baby. Nate let out a breath, his free hand coming up to brush away a tear that escaped down her cheek. Then he leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. This is the best news I could have ever hoped for. When they told Harper and Hazel, the twins screamed with excitement, already planning names and arguing over whether it would be a boy or a girl. Months later, as Sophia lay in the hospital bed, exhausted but glowing, Nate held their newborn son in his arms. Welcome to the family, little one, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia watched him, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had spent so many years believing she was alone that she had to fight every battle herself. But now she had a husband who loved her, daughters who were cherished beyond measure, and a new life to protect. She reached for Nate's hand, intertwining their fingers. We finally made it. He smiled, kissing her softly. We did. Their journey had been filled with struggles, but it had led them here. To love, to family, to forever. Their journey had been filled with pain, struggle, and uncertainty, but it had led them to this moment, a life built on love, resilience, and second chances. Sophia gently brushed her fingers over the baby's tiny hand, watching as Harper and Hazel peeked over the edge of the crib, their eyes wide with wonder. Once she had believed she was alone, that no one would care enough to help her stand again. But fate had proved her wrong. Nathaniel leaned in and kissed her forehead. We finally made it, he whispered. Sophia smiled, feeling the weight of her past finally lift. Yes, we did. Because sometimes life doesn't turn out the way we planned. Sometimes it shatters and leaves us lost. But in those broken moments, in the darkest of days, there's always hope. Always a chance to rebuild, to love again, and to create a future we never thought possible. Their story wasn't just about finding love. It was about resilience, about never giving up, and about the power of kindness. And if there's one thing to take from this journey, it's this. No matter how hard life gets, no matter how lost you feel, your story isn't over yet. A new chapter is always waiting to be written. If you love this story and believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring tale. And remember, sometimes the best endings come from the most unexpected beginnings.